The Galactic Council's emergency session had been called at 300 Standard Time. Admiral Kextar of the Valorian fleet sat hunched over the holographic display, his 4 eyes studying the tactical readouts with growing unease. Around the circular chamber, representatives from dozens of species murmured in hushed tones, their various forms of communication creating a cacophony of worry. The situation on Kepler 442b has deteriorated beyond our worst projections, announced High Counselor Zephyra, her crystalline form shimmering with stress patterns. The Devourers have established 3 major hives on the planet's surface. Our combined fleets have lost 47% of our forces in the last standard week alone. Kextar's primary hands clenched. The Devourers were nightmare incarnate, a hive-minded species that consumed organic matter at an alarming rate, converting it into more of their kind. They had swept through 17 systems in the past year, leaving barren rocks where once thriving worlds had existed. Their exoskeletons could deflect plasma bolts, their acidic blood could eat through starship hulls, and their reproduction rate defied all biological logic. The evacuation of the civilian population is proceeding, continued the High Counselor, but we estimate we can only save 30% before the planet falls completely. The Devourer's advance cannot be stopped with conventional tactics. A low rumble emerged from the Krillian ambassador, his massive form shifting uncomfortably in his specialized seating. Perhaps it is time to consider the nuclear option. Render the planet uninhabitable before they can fully establish their breeding grounds. 2 billion civilians still remain on the surface, Kextar interjected, his voice carrying the weight of command. We cannot sacrifice them. Then what do you propose? The question came from Ambassador Telix, her serpentine form coiled in agitation. Our finest warriors have fallen to these creatures. The Draknari battle clans, renowned across the galaxy for their ferocity, lasted mere hours against a single devourer swarm. Even the mechanical legions of the synthesis have been overwhelmed. The chamber fell silent. Each species represented here had contributed their most elite forces to the defense of Kepler 442b. The Draknari, with their natural aggression and pack-hunting instincts. The synthesis, whose robotic warriors felt no fear and could fight without rest. The Valorians, with their strategic minds and advanced technology. The Kelthara, whose psionic abilities could crush mines from orbit. All had failed. There is one option we have not explored, said a small, quiet voice from the far end of the chamber. All eyes turned to Ambassador Yilneth of the Terran Republic. The human was young by galactic standards, her species having only joined the Council 43 years ago. Humans were considered a curiosity by most, a species that had somehow achieved faster-than-light travel despite their primitive biology and short lifespans. They were known for their adaptability and surprising ingenuity, but militarily, they were considered adequate at best. Speak, Ambassador, urged the High Counselor. Yilneth stood, her movements precise despite her obvious nervousness. The Terran Republic has a specialized military division that has never been deployed in galactic conflicts. We call them the Special Operations Command, but within our military they're known by another name. She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. We call them elite units. A ripple of confusion passed through the chamber. The translation systems struggled with the human term, as it seemed to carry emotional and cultural weight that didn't translate cleanly into other languages. Admiral Kextar leaned forward. What makes these elite units different from your standard military forces? They're volunteers selected from our most dangerous professions and our most challenging environments, Yilneth explained. Former criminals, survivors of apocalyptic scenarios, individuals who have lived through the collapse of civilization on their home regions. They undergo training that... She hesitated again. That would be considered torture by most galactic standards. Torture? Ambassador Telix's form recoiled. The Galactic Council has strict prohibitions against— Not as punishment, Yilneth interrupted. As preparation. They're trained to fight in conditions that would kill most beings. They're conditioned to operate when wounded, when starving, when faced with impossible odds. They're taught to use anything as a weapon, to find tactical advantages in any environment, to never surrender even when facing certain death. The Krillian ambassador rumbled skeptically. This sounds like typical human hyperbole. Your species is known for exaggeration in military matters. Yilneth's expression hardened slightly. 3 months ago, a transport ship carrying 12 elite units crash-landed on Xerion Prime during a pirate raid. Xerion Prime, as you know, is a world overrun by the Ravager clans, approximately 50,000 organized raiders using the planet as their base of operations. She activated her personal holo display, showing tactical readouts. Within 72 hours, the Ravager leadership was dead. Their supply depots had been destroyed, and their communication networks had been completely dismantled. 12 humans, with nothing but what they could scavenge from the crash site, had effectively ended a pirate operation that had plagued 3-star systems for over a decade. The chamber erupted in murmurs of disbelief. Kextar studied the data flowing across his displays. The reports were verified by multiple independent sources. "How many of these elite units does Terra have available?" he asked quietly. "For this operation? 500? 500, repeated the High Counselor, her crystalline form dimming with doubt. "Against billions of devourers." "It's not about the numbers," Yilneth said firmly. "It's about understanding what humans are capable of when we're pushed to our absolute limits. The elite units aren't just soldiers. They're survivors of our species' darkest chapters. They've lived through nuclear winters, plague outbreaks, societal collapses, and ecological disasters. They've learned to thrive in conditions that most beings would consider uninhabitable." She brought up another display, showing grainy footage from a training exercise. The video showed humans moving through an environment that appeared to be actively on fire, using improvised weapons to fight targets that were barely visible in the smoke and flames. "This is a standard training scenario for elite units," Yilneth continued. "They call it Hell Week, but it lasts for 6 months. They're dropped into the most hostile environments we can create with minimal equipment, and they're expected not just to survive, but to complete complex military objectives." Admiral Kextar watched the footage with growing interest. The humans moved with a fluid efficiency that was unlike anything he had seen from other species' military forces. They seemed to anticipate each other's actions, working together with a synchronization that bordered on telepathic, yet he knew humans possessed no such abilities. "What are their casualty rates during this training?" asked Ambassador Telix. "Approximately 40% don't complete the program," Yilneth admitted. "But those who do emerge as something different. They don't think like normal humans anymore. They don't react to pain, fear, or stress the way civilians do. They become weapons in the truest sense. And you believe these elite units can succeed where our combined forces have failed?" The question came from Commander Mordak of the Hegemony, his cybernetic implants gleaming as he processed the data. "I believe they can do what no one else has been willing to do," Yilneth replied. "Fight the Devourers on their own terms, in close combat, in the dark, in conditions so horrific that normal soldiers would break before they could even engage the enemy." The High Counselor's form flickered with consideration. "What would they require for deployment?" "Minimal support. They prefer to operate independently, using whatever resources they can find or capture on site. Standard transport ships, basic weapons, and medical supplies. They'll handle the rest." "The rest being?" Yilneth's expression became carefully neutral. "The elite units have their own methods for dealing with hostile forces, methods that most civilized species would find disturbing." A long silence settled over the chamber as the implications of her words sank in. Finally, Admiral Kextar spoke. Ambassador, with respect to your species' capabilities, the Devourers have overwhelmed forces armed with weapons that could level continents. They've destroyed fleets equipped with shields that could deflect stellar radiation. What could 500 humans possibly do that our most advanced military forces could not? Yilneth turned to face him directly, her eyes carrying a weight that seemed at odds with her young appearance. Admiral, every species in this chamber has developed their military doctrine around the concept of civilized warfare, rules of engagement, minimizing collateral damage, preserving infrastructure, protecting non-combatants. These are admirable principles, and they reflect the best aspects of galactic civilization. She paused, her hands clasped behind her back in a gesture that somehow conveyed both respect and warning. But humans learned warfare in a different school. We learned it during ice ages that lasted millennia, during global conflicts that consumed entire continents, during plagues that reduced our population to scattered survivors hiding in ruins. We learned it from each other, when we were both predator and prey. Our elite units are the inheritors of that knowledge. What exactly are you suggesting? The High Counselor asked slowly. I'm suggesting that perhaps the Devourers haven't faced an enemy that truly understands savagery, Yilneth replied. An enemy that can match their brutality, exceed their ruthlessness, and surpass their adaptability. The elite units don't fight to preserve civilization, they fight to survive, and they've learned that sometimes survival requires becoming something that civilization would prefer to forget. The chamber fell silent again. But this time, the quality of the silence was different. There was an undercurrent of unease, as if the assembled representatives were beginning to understand that they might be considering something that would fundamentally change their perspective on humanity. Finally, Admiral Kextar spoke. What are the political ramifications if we approve this deployment? Terra will take full responsibility for the elite unit's actions, Yilneth assured him. No other species will be held accountable for whatever methods they employ. But I must warn you, once they're deployed, they operate with complete tactical autonomy. They cannot be recalled, redirected, or restrained until their mission is complete. And what exactly would their mission parameters be? Yilneth's answer was simple, delivered in a tone that was both matter-of-fact and somehow deeply unsettling. Eliminate all Devourer presence on Kepler 442b by any means necessary. The vote was called 30 minutes later. The motion passed by a margin of 3 votes. As the emergency session concluded and the representatives began filing out of the chamber, Admiral Kexatar approached the human ambassador. Yilneth, may I ask you a personal question? She nodded, though her expression remained guarded. Have you ever met one of these elite units yourself? Her response came after a long pause, and when she spoke, her voice carried a note of something that might have been fear or respect, or perhaps both. Once, during a diplomatic function on Terra, he was introduced as a security advisor. She was quiet for a moment, remembering. He was polite, well-educated, perfectly civilized. But when he shook my hand, I could see it in his eyes. The knowledge of what he was capable of, what he had done, what he was prepared to do. And what did you see there? Yilneth met the Admiral's gaze directly. I saw something that understood that sometimes, to protect what you love, you have to become something that those you love would be afraid of. As she walked away, Admiral Kextar found himself wondering if they had just made a decision that would save the galaxy, or irreversibly change their understanding of what it meant to be civilized. The deployment orders went out that night. The transport ship Endurance dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler 442 system with barely a ripple in space-time. Unlike the massive dreadnoughts and carrier groups that had preceded it, the human vessel was unremarkable. A simple cargo hauler that registered on sensors as carrying mining equipment and industrial supplies. Captain Marcus Chen stood on the bridge, watching the tactical display update with the latest intelligence from the evacuation fleet. The planet below was a mottled brown and green, but growing patches of dark corruption spread across its surface like an infection. Those dark areas were where the Devourers had fully established their hives. 500 souls, muttered Chief Navigator Torres, shaking her head as she processed the deployment manifest. Against all that, Chen didn't respond. He'd learned long ago not to question the elite units. He'd been transporting them for 7 years, and while he'd never seen them in actual combat, he'd picked up the survivors from enough training exercises to know they operated by different rules than anyone else in the galaxy. "Captain," came a voice from behind him. Chen turned to see Colonel Sarah Voss approaching the bridge. She moved with the characteristic gait of an elite unit. Fluid, purposeful, every step calculated for maximum efficiency. Her uniform was standard Terran military, but Chen noticed the small modifications: reinforced joints, additional pockets for equipment, and fabric that seemed designed to shed blood and other substances. "Colonel," Chen acknowledged, "we're 3 hours from orbital insertion." "Good." Voss moved to the observation deck, staring down at the infected world. "What's the current status of the other evacuation ships?" "Pulling back to minimum safe distance. The Devourer atmospheric flyers have been taking out anything that gets too close to the surface. We've lost 6 transports in the last 2 days. Voss nodded, unsurprised. "And the remaining ground forces?" "Scattered resistance pockets. Maybe a few thousand soldiers from various species, trapped in the major cities. They're not expected to last more than another day or 2. "Understood." Voss activated her wrist communicator. "All units, prep for deployment. Standard loadout, expect no resupply, assume no extraction." Chen frowned. "Colonel, surely Command will arrange for some form of support." "Captain," Voss interrupted, her tone polite but final. "The elite units don't fight with the expectation of support. We fight with the expectation that we're already dead, and everything after that is borrowed time." 3 hours later, the drop pods began launching from the Endurance. Each pod was designed to look like debris from destroyed ships, a deception that had worked countless times before. The pods scattered across the planet's surface, some landing in the corrupted zones, others near the remaining civilian settlements, and a few deliberately targeting the largest Devourer hive complexes. Staff Sergeant David Wolfe Morrison's pod crashed through the canopy of what had once been a pristine forest. Now the trees were twisted, black structures that dripped with organic slime, and the air itself seemed thick with spores and the sounds of chittering. He emerged from his pod, quickly gathering his gear, and immediately began applying a mixture of local mud and chemical compounds to his skin and equipment. The mixture served multiple purposes. It masked his human scent, provided camouflage, and contained several compounds that were toxic to most known alien biology. Wolfe had developed the formula himself during a 6-month survival exercise on a world overrun by hostile plant life. His communicator crackled with whispered reports from other units. "Reaper 2-7, in position near Hive Alpha. Devourer patrol patterns confirmed. They move in groups of 12, rotating every 4 hours. Ghost Unit, civilian enclave located. Approximately 300 survivors, mostly Valorian families. Defending force down to 6 soldiers, critical ammunition shortage. Hammer Squad. Landed in the middle of a feeding ground. Jesus Christ, the smell. Beginning stealth approach to secondary hive." Wolfe moved through the corrupted forest with practiced silence. The elite units had trained in environments like this for years. Worlds where the very air was poison, where every surface could hide a threat, where the difference between life and death was often measured in milliseconds. He found his first Devourer 20 minutes after landing. The creature was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with an exoskeleton that gleamed like polished obsidian. Its four arms ended in razor-sharp claws that could slice through tank armor, and its mandibles dripped with acidic saliva. It was feeding on something that might once have been a Draknari warrior. Wolf watched it for 10 minutes, studying its movements, its feeding patterns, its sensory responses. This was something the other galactic forces had failed to do. They'd engaged the Devourers in direct combat, relying on superior firepower and technology. They'd tried to fight them like civilized warriors. The elite units had learned to hunt them like predators. Wolf circled around behind the creature, moving with infinite patience. When he finally struck, it wasn't with energy weapons or high-tech explosives. It was with a ceramic blade coated with a neurotoxin derived from Terran deep-sea organisms, thrust precisely between two plates of the Devourer's exoskeleton and into its central nervous cluster. The creature dropped without making a sound. Wolf immediately began his next task. Using a field kit that would have puzzled most galactic scientists, he began harvesting biological samples from the dead Devourer. Pheromone glands, digestive acids, sensory organs. Within 15 minutes, he had everything he needed to begin the process of disguise. Across the planet, similar scenes were playing out. Elite units weren't just killing Devourers. They were learning from them, adapting to them, becoming something that could move among them undetected. Lieutenant Commander Anna Wraith Petrov had landed near the largest civilian enclave. Unlike her colleagues who were operating in stealth mode, her mission required a more direct approach. She needed to buy time for the evacuation ships to reach the survivors. The Valorian soldiers defending the enclave were exhausted, their energy weapons nearly depleted, their defensive perimeter shrinking by the hour. When Wraith approached their command post, they barely looked up from their tactical displays. "Human officer," announced the Valorian captain, his four eyes dim with fatigue. "We appreciate any assistance you can offer, but unless you have reinforcements or heavy weapons, I'm afraid there's little you can do. We estimate 6 more hours before the perimeter is overrun." Wraith studied the tactical situation. 300 civilians, 6 defenders, and approximately 2,000 Devourers approaching from multiple directions. It was the kind of scenario that military academies used as an example of an impossible situation. "Captain," she said calmly, "I need you to fall back to the secondary defensive line and prepare the civilians for immediate evacuation. Transport ships will be here in 8 hours. The Valorian looked at her with something approaching pity. "You misunderstand our situation. We have 8 hours to live, not 8 hours to hold position." "I understand perfectly," Wraith replied, checking her equipment. "I'm going to buy us those 8 hours. How? By going hunting. What happened next would be discussed in military academies across the galaxy for decades to come, though the recordings were classified at the highest levels and shown only to select audiences. Wraith didn't wait for the Devourers to attack the perimeter. Instead, she went out to meet them. Her first encounter was with a Devourer scout patrol, 6 creatures moving through the ruins of what had been a small town. She didn't engage them with weapons. Instead, she used the environment itself. A deliberately triggered building collapse that channeled the patrol into a narrow alley, industrial chemicals from a damaged factory that created a toxic cloud when mixed with Devourer bodily fluids, improvised explosives that turned debris into shrapnel. But it wasn't just the tactics that disturbed the watching Valorian soldiers. It was the way she moved, the expression on her face, the complete absence of fear or hesitation. She fought with the methodical precision of someone who had long ago accepted that violence was simply another tool, no different from a hammer or a wrench. When the first major wave of Devourers approached the perimeter, they found not a defensive position, but a kill zone that had been carefully prepared. Every approach was mined, every piece of cover was rigged to collapse, and every escape route led into a worse trap. But Wraith wasn't finished. As the Devourers tried to regroup, she began hunting them individually, using techniques that made the watching aliens distinctly uncomfortable. She used their own acidic blood against them, turning their wounds into weapons. She employed psychological warfare, leaving the bodies of their dead arranged in patterns that seemed designed to intimidate the survivors. She turned their hive mind communication against them, using captured pheromones to send false signals that led groups of Devourers into ambushes. Within 6 hours, the Devourer assault had not only been repelled, but their local command structure had been completely dismantled. The creatures that remained were fleeing in panic, something that Galactic Council forces had never observed before. Meanwhile, deep in the primary hive complex, Wolf had completed his biological modifications. Using Devourer pheromones and harvested tissue, he had created a chemical camouflage that allowed him to move freely among the creatures. To their senses, he appeared to be one of them. The hive was a nightmare of organic architecture, walls that pulsed with life, floors that were soft with decomposing matter, and air that was thick with spores and digestive enzymes. Wolf moved through it all with the calm focus of someone who had trained for exactly this environment. He wasn't there to fight. He was there to gather intelligence and set charges. The Devourer's reproduction process required specific environmental conditions: temperature, humidity, chemical composition. Wolf had spent years studying similar biological systems, and he understood exactly how to disrupt them. The charges he placed weren't conventional explosives. They were carefully designed devices that would alter the hive's internal chemistry in ways that would make reproduction impossible. But more importantly, they would turn the hive's own biological processes against it. As Wolf worked his way deeper into the complex, he encountered something that made him pause. A chamber filled with what appeared to be Devourer eggs, but these were different, larger, more complex, with unusual neural development patterns. These weren't just more Devourers. They were the next stage of evolution: smarter, more adaptable, designed for space combat rather than planetary assault. If these creatures matured and spread to other worlds, they would be nearly impossible to stop. Wolf didn't hesitate. He activated an emergency beacon, transmitting his findings to the other elite units, and then began placing additional charges throughout the breeding chamber. Across the planet, similar discoveries were being made. The elite units were finding evidence that the Devourer invasion of Kepler 442b was just the beginning, a testing ground for new biological weapons that would eventually be deployed against the entire galaxy. As the evacuation ships finally arrived to collect the surviving civilians, Admiral Kekstar studied the reports coming in from the planet's surface. In less than 12 hours, 500 human soldiers had accomplished something that 50,000 galactic troops had failed to do in 3 weeks. They hadn't just stopped the Devourer advance, they had turned the hunters into the hunted. "Sir," reported his communications officer, "we're receiving a transmission from the elite unit commander on the surface." "Put her through." Colonel Voss's voice was calm, professional, and somehow deeply unsettling. "Admiral, civilian evacuation is proceeding as scheduled. We've neutralized the immediate Devourer threat and discovered intelligence indicating this was a staging ground for a much larger invasion. Colonel, our sensors indicate massive biological disruption across the planet. What's your status?" "Phase 1 complete, sir. We've eliminated the Devourer command structure, disrupted their reproduction capabilities, and established control over key strategic positions. We're now preparing for Phase 2. "Which is?" There was a pause, and when Voss spoke again, her voice carried a note that made Admiral Kekstar distinctly uncomfortable. "Complete eradication, sir. We've learned enough about Devourer biology to ensure they can never use this world again. But the methods we'll need to employ, I recommend all galactic forces maintain minimum safe distance for the next 72 hours. "Colonel, what exactly are you planning?" "Sir, The elite units are going to show these creatures what humans learned during our darkest periods. We're going to teach them why evolution made us the apex predators on a world full of things that wanted to eat us." The transmission ended, leaving Admiral Kextar staring at the tactical display with growing unease. For the first time since humanity had joined the Galactic Council, he was beginning to understand that they might have just allied themselves with something far more dangerous than the enemies they faced. Below them on the planet's surface, the real war was about to begin. The Galactic Fleet maintained position at the edge of the system, their sensors trained on Kepler 442b as the planet began to change in ways that defied explanation. Admiral Kextar found himself checking the readings every few minutes, unable to believe what his instruments were telling him. "The biological signatures are unprecedented," reported his science officer, Commander Yiltek. "The devourer population appears to be declining rapidly, but not from conventional combat. Their behavior patterns have completely altered." On the main display, heat signatures showed scattered groups of devourers fleeing from areas where they had previously established dominance. More disturbing were the locations that registered no biological activity at all. Dead zones where even the planet's native microorganisms seemed to have ceased functioning. "Admiral," came a transmission from the Draknari battlecruiser, Blood Fang. "Our deep-range sensors are detecting unusual atmospheric changes near the primary hive sites, requesting permission to investigate." "Denied," Kextar replied immediately. "All vessels maintain current distance until further notice." He had no desire to discover what the elite units were doing on the planet's surface. The fragments of communications they'd intercepted were disturbing enough. References to biological conversion, psychological conditioning, and environmental restructuring. The humans spoke in their characteristic understated way, but the implications were terrifying. On the planet's surface, Staff Sergeant Morrison crouched in what had once been the primary devourer breeding facility. The organic walls around him were dying, turning from the healthy black-green of active hive material to a sickly gray that crumbled at the touch. The air, which had been thick with spores and pheromones 12 hours ago, now carried the scent of decay and something else: fear. The devourers had learned to be afraid. Morrison had spent the night implementing techniques that humanity had developed during its darkest periods. During the resource wars of the 21st century, when desperate populations had turned to biological warfare. During the collapse periods, when survival meant becoming something that civilization would prefer not to acknowledge. The charges he had placed weren't designed to destroy the hive through explosion. Instead, they released carefully engineered organisms, modified bacteria that consumed the specific proteins devourer biology depended on. But more importantly, they released chemical compounds that triggered responses in the devourer nervous system. Responses that human researchers had cataloged and refined over decades of studying terror as a weapon. The elite units had learned that every species, no matter how alien, shared certain fundamental responses to threat, and humans had become exceptionally skilled at triggering those responses. "Wolf to control," Morrison whispered into his communicator. "Primary hive is neutralized. Implementing Protocol 7. Protocol 7 was something that existed only in the most classified human military documents. It was based on studies conducted during humanity's wars of extermination, refined through centuries of conflict, where the goal wasn't just victory, but the complete psychological destruction of the enemy's will to resist. Morrison began placing a different kind of device throughout the dying hive. These were broadcasting units that would transmit a specific pattern of sounds and electromagnetic pulses, a pattern that had been discovered to cause profound distress in almost all known neural architectures. The pattern was based on the death cries of young mammals, modified through harmonic analysis to trigger protective instincts in almost any sentient species, then inverted to create a sense of wrongness that bypassed rational thought and struck directly at the most primitive parts of the brain. It was, in essence, weaponized nightmare. Across the planet, other elite units were implementing similar protocols. Lieutenant Commander Petrov had discovered that devourers communicated through complex pheromone combinations. She had spent hours analyzing their chemical language, and now she was broadcasting messages that roughly translated to accounts of unimaginable torment, descriptions of pain that exceeded the physical capacity of their nervous systems. The devourers receiving these messages had no framework for understanding that they were artificial. Their hive mind began to believe that their comrades were experiencing tortures beyond description, and that these tortures were being inflicted by creatures that understood their biology better than they understood it themselves. Master Sergeant Elena Reaper Kowalski had taken a different approach. She had captured 3 devourer scouts alive and was conducting what the elite units euphemistically called behavioral conditioning. Using techniques developed during humanity's psychological warfare programs, she was systematically breaking down their mental defenses and rebuilding them with specific associations. Pain associated with the scent of humans, terror triggered by certain visual patterns that humans naturally created when they moved, paralysis induced by sounds within the human vocal range. She was turning the captured devourers into living broadcast stations, transmitting fear directly into the hive mind through their shared consciousness. The results were beyond anything the galactic military had achieved. Devourer forces across the planet were abandoning their positions, fleeing underground, or simply shutting down their nervous systems in what appeared to be species-wide catatonia. But the elite units weren't finished. Colonel Voss stood in the command center that her team had established in the ruins of the planet's former capital. Around her, monitors displayed the status of dozens of ongoing operations. Her teams weren't just defeating the devourers. They were conducting a comprehensive campaign to ensure that this species would never again pose a threat to galactic civilization. "Ma'am," reported Sergeant Torres from his position at the biological monitoring station, "we've successfully introduced the modified organisms into the planetary ecosystem. Preliminary models indicate that any future devourer colonies will face immediate systematic organ failure upon exposure to the modified environment." And the psychological conditioning? Broadcasting at 97% coverage. Devourer neural activity has decreased by 85% planet-wide. Those that remain active are exhibiting extreme avoidance behaviors toward anything associated with human presence. Voss nodded, studying the tactical displays. "Implement Phase 3. Begin the demonstration protocols." Phase 3 was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the elite unit's mission. Having defeated the immediate devourer threat, they now needed to ensure that the broader devourer species, spread across dozens of worlds, understood the consequences of threatening humanity or its allies. Teams of elite units began constructing installations across the planet's surface. These weren't military facilities in any conventional sense. They were monuments, designed to broadcast a specific message to any devourer ship that might arrive in the system. The monuments incorporated devourer biological material in ways that would be immediately recognizable to their species. Architectural patterns that mimicked their hive structures, but twisted into forms that suggested dominance and subjugation. Broadcasting equipment that transmitted on devourer communication frequencies, sending detailed recordings of everything that had been done to their forces on Kepler 4.42b. But most disturbing of all were the psychological profiles. The elite units had captured enough devourer specimens to conduct comprehensive analysis of their mental architecture. They now understood how this species processed fear, pain, and despair, and they had designed their monuments to trigger all 3 responses simultaneously. Any devourer force that approached the system would receive a clear message. Humanity understood them completely, could destroy them utterly, and would do so without hesitation or mercy if threatened. 3 days after the elite units had begun their operations, Admiral Kexitar received a communication from the planet's surface. Admiral, this is Colonel Voss. Mission complete. Kepler 442b is secure for recolonization. The Devourer threat has been permanently neutralized. Colonel, Kextar replied carefully, our long-range sensors are detecting some unusual installations on the planet's surface. Could you clarify their purpose? Educational facilities, sir, designed to prevent future incidents. Educational? Yes, sir. Should any other Devourer forces attempt to establish colonies in this region of space, they'll receive a comprehensive education about the consequences of threatening Galactic Council worlds. Kextar studied the sensor readings from the planet. The installations were massive, clearly visible from orbit, and seemed to pulse with some form of energy that registered on multiple spectrums. Colonel, I'm looking at energy signatures that suggest these installations are broadcasting across interstellar distances. That's correct, sir. The educational materials need to reach a wide audience. What exactly are you broadcasting? There was a pause before Voss replied, and when she spoke, her voice carried a note of something that might have been pride or satisfaction, or perhaps something else entirely. Everything, sir. Complete biological profiles of Devourer physiology, detailed analysis of their psychological architecture, and comprehensive documentation of the most effective methods for defeating them. We're sharing our educational materials with any Devourer ship within a 50-light-year radius. Admiral Kextar felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental systems. Colonel, are you saying that you've discovered ways to reliably defeat Devourer forces? Not just defeat them, sir. We've learned how to make them afraid, how to break their will to fight before combat even begins, how to turn their own biology against them, how to make them understand that there are worse things than death, and that humans are capable of inflicting all of them. The communication ended, leaving Kextar staring at his tactical displays with growing unease. Around him, his bridge crew worked in unusual quiet, as if they too were beginning to understand the implications of what they had witnessed. Over the next several days, reports began arriving from across the galaxy. Devourer fleets that had been approaching populated worlds suddenly changed course, fleeing to the outer rim. Established Devourer colonies began broadcasting surrender signals to any vessels that would receive them. Most disturbing of all, xenobiologists reported that captured Devourer specimens were exhibiting unprecedented behavioral changes when exposed to any stimulus associated with human presence. The species that had terrorized the galaxy for over a year was retreating into the deepest regions of space, abandoning conquests that had taken them months to establish, seemingly driven by fear of an enemy they had barely encountered. Ambassador Yilneth found herself called before an emergency session of the Galactic Council Security Committee. The mood in the chamber was unlike anything she had experienced during her tenure as Earth's representative. Ambassador, began High Counselor Zephyra, her crystalline form flickering with stress patterns. We need to understand exactly what your elite units did on Kepler 442b. They completed their mission, High Counselor. The planet is secure, the civilian population has been evacuated safely, and the Devourer threat has been neutralized. But how? The question came from Admiral Kextar, who looked as if he hadn't slept since returning from the Kepler system. Our xenobiologists have been studying the Devourers for over a year. They've shown no fear response to anything we've encountered. Yet your forces seem to have terrified them into complete retreat. Yilneth considered her words carefully. She had read the classified reports from the elite units, and she understood why the galactic community was disturbed. High Counselor, the elite units approach warfare from a perspective that most galactic species would find unfamiliar. They don't simply seek to defeat an enemy in tactical terms. They seek to understand that enemy so completely that they can predict and control their responses. Control their responses how? Through the application of techniques that humanity developed during our pre-spaceflight period. Techniques for influencing behavior, for inducing specific psychological states, for turning an enemy's own biology against them. Commander Mordak of the hegemony leaned forward, his cybernetic implants processing data rapidly. Ambassador, are you describing some form of advanced psychological warfare? More than that, Yilneth admitted. The elite units study their enemies the way a biologist studies a specimen. They identify weaknesses, develop countermeasures, and create strategies that exploit not just tactical vulnerabilities, but biological and psychological ones as well. And the installations they've built on the planet's surface? Educational tools, designed to ensure that the broader devourer species understands the consequences of future aggressive actions. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. Finally, Ambassador Telix spoke, her serpentine form coiled with tension. Ambassador, what you're describing sounds like systematic terror as a military strategy. Yilneth met her gaze directly. Ambassador Telix, humanity spent millennia as both predator and prey on a world where survival often depended on understanding fear better than those who would harm you. The elite units are the inheritors of that understanding. But the Devourers made a fundamental error, Yilneth continued. They assumed that all species develop military doctrine based on civilized principles. They never encountered an enemy that understood savagery as a science, that could match their brutality and exceed their ruthlessness, that could teach them to fear something more than they feared death. High Counselor Zephyra's form dimmed considerably. Ambassador, what exactly have your elite units taught the Devourers to fear? Yilneth's answer was delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone she had used throughout the session, but somehow it carried a weight that made every being in the chamber profoundly uncomfortable. Us, High Counselor. They've taught them to fear us. The session adjourned 30 minutes later, but the real discussions had only just begun. Over the following weeks, as news of humanity's methods spread through the galactic community, a new understanding began to emerge. The species that had joined the Galactic Council as a junior member, that had been considered militarily adequate at best, had revealed capabilities that fundamentally altered the balance of power in the galaxy. They possessed techniques and knowledge that could break an enemy's will to fight, that could turn biological systems against themselves, that could weaponize fear itself. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the realization that the elite units represented only a fraction of humanity's population. They were volunteers drawn from the margins of human society, shaped by training that most beings would consider torture. Yet they spoke of their methods with the casual efficiency of engineers discussing a technical problem. What did that suggest about the species that had produced them? Admiral Kextar found his answer when he met Colonel Voss during the post-mission debriefing. She sat across from him in the conference room aboard his flagship, calmly reviewing tactical reports, appearing for all the world like any other professional military officer. "Colonel," he said finally, "may I ask you a personal question?" "Of course, Admiral." "Do you consider what your units did on Kepler 442b to be warfare?" Voss looked up from her reports, considering the question seriously. "No, Admiral. What we did was pest control. Warfare implies an enemy worthy of respect. The Devourers were simply a biological hazard that required specialized disposal techniques. And if you had been facing a more civilized enemy, then we would have used different tools," she replied simply. "The elite units maintain capabilities across the full spectrum of conflict, from diplomatic solutions to complete systematic eradication. We use whatever methods are required to protect human interests and those of our allies." Admiral Kextar studied her calm expression, her professional demeanor, her complete lack of emotional response to discussing techniques that had terrified an entire species into retreat. "Colonel, What would it take for humanity to use its most extreme capabilities against a galactic civilization? Voss's answer came without hesitation. Threaten something we care about, Admiral. Threaten our families, our worlds, our future. Make us believe that our survival depends on your destruction. She paused, her expression remaining perfectly neutral. But I would strongly advise against it. The elite units represent maybe 1% of what humanity is capable of when we decide that something needs to cease existing. As the Admiral watched her return to her reports, he realized that the galaxy had fundamentally changed. They had gained an invaluable ally against threats like the Devourers, but they had also learned that some allies could be more terrifying than enemies. Humanity had earned their place at the galactic table not through superior technology or advanced civilization, but by demonstrating that they understood violence in ways that other species preferred not to contemplate. The elite units returned to Earth 3 weeks later, their mission complete. They had saved over 2 million civilian lives, permanently neutralized a galactic threat, and established humanity's position as a force that even the darkest corners of the galaxy would prefer not to provoke. But perhaps most importantly, they had shown the universe that sometimes, to protect what you love, you have to become something that those you love would be afraid of. And humanity was very good at being afraid of the right things.